Okay, welcome to week 2. So, I wanted to finish the video that we were watching last week. It's going to introduce some critical things here at the end. And then there's another one I found that is an example of kind of what John Hick's up to in the no. What am I thinking? Yeah, John Roth. All these Johns. What John Roth is up to in the first chapter of the book. But let's do that critical stuff first. But first thing to do is check in, just sort of make sure, does anybody have any questions lingering or thoughts from last week? Nothing in particular? Okay. Well, I think I have it lined up. Share screen. There we go. Now, if I have it right, this is going to be it here. So yeah, we just finished with, oh yeah, just the Hick. That's why we just finished with John Hick, and now she's going to go into some of the details from Irenaeus to explain a little bit about how his view was different than Hick's, his old view. Okay, come on.
Irenaeus continues then with an example in Against Heresies in Book 4 or Chapter 4. He gives the example of the potter and the clay. The potter needs the clay to remain wet so that it can be moulded. Once the clay has become dry, it can no longer be used. God is the potter, humans are the clay. We need to remain open to God so that God can help us receive moral and spiritual perfection. Basically, we need to remain open to God so that God can help mold us. If we dry up, turn our backs on God, we ignore God, etc., God can't help mold us. And so therefore we are just like useless clay. We are no good and we'll just be sent straight to hell. He can't do anything with us. God's hands help mold us through the existence of natural evil. So turning to God in the face of natural evil and asking for his help, looking for his support, etc., is important. Natural evil shapes us from the image to the likeness, develops desirable, I thought I said miserable then, desirable moral qualities or virtues. So again, Irenaeus and John Hick both believe in the image to likeness idea. And so it's all this continuous thread of natural evil testing us, natural evil turning to God so that we can be molded, supported, shaped, so that we turn to good in the face of these challenges and therefore moving from image to likeness. Humans cannot get to God by their own means. We need a helping hand, the hand of God. Now, a couple of quotes here. There's very little left now of the PowerPoint. These are the extra names. Those are the two main arguments that you've covered. We start with a quote from David Hume. Now, I aren't a massive fan of
David Hume, great Scottish philosopher, late 1700s.
David Hume. I think sometimes he criticises things for the sake of criticising. However, this quote for me is brilliant. I think he really hits the nail on the head. Could not our world be a little more hospitable and still teach us what we need to know? Does the suffering have to be so extreme? So what Hume is arguing there is, fair enough, test us, God, send us tests. Do the tests have to be quite this bad? Do the test, the extreme natural and moral evils that we face in the world, do they have to be quite as bad as this? We can learn from less bad things. Why does the bad and the evil have to be so great? And so this is the idea that our world can be a bit more hospitable, a bit nicer, and we'd still learn. Does it have to be quite as extreme? You then have Elie Wiesel there. Elie Wiesel, magnificent man. I highly recommend you read his books. He is an Auschwitz survivor. He lost his whole family in the Holocaust. One of the famous pictures of the bunk beds. He is one of the men's faces in that, and he survived and he went on to write books. He won a Pulitzer Prize. And one of the books he wrote was The Trial of God. And basically in this book, he puts God on trial. Why does he put God on trial? I think when I read it a long time ago. He's set in like a pub or a saloon bar or something like that. But basically, he wants to put God on trial. The trial of, you did not give me what you gave Job in the Bible. And so he put God in trial. And I think they found God guilty in this book. But basically, in Psalms...
it's important to know this actually happened in real life, and it's curious that she doesn't know that. The prisoners at Auschwitz at one point actually did this. They put God on trial, and so Wiesel was writing about that in a novel form. But yeah, that actually happened, and they did find him guilty.
A man, and he had a wonderful life, believed in God, and the devil basically said, well, Job only loves you, God, because he has everything he wants. So of course he's going to love you, God. He's going to hedge his bets. I might as well keep loving the God because everything's great and well. And so then Job loses everything. His family dies, his livestock dies, he loses his land, he loses everything. Yet he still worships and supports and loves God. And so God basically goes to the devil and says, he still likes me. And so it was to prove that.
And remember, in the story, it's not the devil. That's a weird Christian confusion. In Hebrew, Shaitan is a employee of God. So it's not. It's weird how Christians read that. It's the devil. Anyway, but it is the same basic problem that God is testing him. Poor Job
loved God, not because of what he received or all the grandeurs that he got, but because he just loved God. And so then what God did was he rewarded Job, and he got land and riches and virgins and everything he could want. And he lived happily for the rest of his life. So his poor wife and daughters in the first story, they died, but then he got lots more family. And so Job was quite all right. And basically he was rewarded for staying faithful to God. So what Eli Wiesel's point is I survived the Holocaust. I still believed in you. Where is my riches and land and support and love? Where are the things that you've given me for remaining a faithful servant? And at this point, I think Eli Wiesel did lose his faith in God. I think he refound it years later. But it's the idea that he questioned, why should I worship a God like you? What are you worthy of worship when I've gone through the worst imaginable torture and I still believed in you and I've got nothing?
Casper delivers your best night's rest for an even better tomorrow. Save up to $600 off mattresses at Casper.com or a store near you.
My friend used to pay $163 for car insurance. Now look how much he pays.
Okay.
Last little bit then. So the supports of free will. You might want to use these names to say why free will again is so important. The first is again John Hick. John Hick argues that God had to give us free will because love has to be earned. God could not force us to love him. If God didn't give us free will and we just loved God, well, we're not doing that out of free choice. He had to give us free will, so we freely loved him. Love cannot be forced. And I always show the students the clip from Aladdin where he gets the wishes, and one of the wishes the genie says is that he can't grant is I can't make somebody fall in love with you. Love has to be earned, not forced. And Peter Vardy there in his lovely pale green sweater, and he gives the illustration of the peasant girl. Basically, a king falls in love with a peasant girl. He can force her to marry him, but not for her to love him. Love has to be earned. And so it's the idea that we had to have free will so that we freely love God, or God earns our love. Alvin Plantinga says a world containing free creatures is far more valuable than a world containing robots. Process theology from Whitehead and Griffin is the idea that God did the first move, and then it carries on.
Okay, so Griffin is one of the guys in the book, so we'll spend some time, especially on this point from process theology.
Separately from God, so he lacks omnipotence in that way. Maybe again you could do a link there to nature of God and how God self-limits, or it's a self-limitation of his own omnipotence, but God doesn't intervene once he's got it started. He steps back. The thing I like about process theology is the idea that God suffers with us, that like a parent and a child, if you see something happen to a child as a parent, it would hurt you just as much. So if God's made us and he's made us in his image, and we're high up on the hierarchy of being, like Augustine says, maybe God hurts with us. Maybe God, cries along when we are in pain and suffering. Richard Swinburne, sorry, gives two nice little analogies there. You don't need to use both of them, just use one. But basically, we need total free will. So if God kept intervening, he'd be like an overprotective parent, just picking us up every time we fall over. Or we'd be like a toy world, like a Sims game, where God's just moving the chess pieces and we just puppet along the actions. No, God has to leave us alone. He has to leave us to do our own devices, and then punishes us afterwards if we do it wrong. But he has to give us complete free will. Finally, you have Dostoevsky.
Now, the thing that should stand out is none of them respond to that problem of scale that Hume raised. And it's what's remarkable is no one seems to. It's a point that seems to stand and is the Achilles heel of all of these efforts for people doing the Odysseys is they have a hard time coming up with how to deal with that problem. So they usually will ignore it. Just talk about whatever they're going to talk about and pretend scale isn't really a problem, or they've never heard of David Hume.
Dostoevsky, him and his brother, superb literature writers, absolutely magnificent writers. If you go on to study literature at university, you'll probably come across Dostoevsky. And the Brothers Karamazov, he talks about, I can't remember, I need to look this up at some point. I can't remember if this is a true story or a fictional one, but I imagine even if it is fiction, that it's based on something he's either seen or heard of in his time, because it sounds like a story that could be genuine and real. So maybe do a little bit of your own research on the history of the story. But basically, the story goes is that a servant lived in a big master's house, and the servant boy was playing with the master's prize hunting dogs, and one of the hunting dogs breaks its leg, and then this dog is therefore useless. It can't go hunting, it basically needs to be shot. And so as punishment, even though the little boy didn't break its leg, he takes the clothes off the little boy, sets the little boy running across the field, and sets all the other dogs after him to maul him to death while his parents stand and watch. And this story is to show that for Dostoevsky, free will comes at too high a price. The suffering of innocent children is too high a price to pay for the gift of freedom. If this is what we do with our free will, take it back, God. Take back my free will. It comes with too much responsibility, and people do the most horrible things. And so it's just the idea of the golden ticket. Take the golden ticket of free will back. I do not want it if this is how people use that free will to hurt others.
Yeah, and this is another example. It's just a very dramatic example of the scale problem.
It comes at too high a price. And so he's saying, I don't want free will if you've given it to me. I don't want free will to human beings because this is what we do to one another. Right, folks, that was quite a biggie. Hopefully you found that useful. Hopefully I've gone over a few things that just to clarify.
Yeah, I thought it useful. So what do you think?
Okay, my head's kind of spinning.
That's an overview, so we're I'll go into the details as we go along. Okay, that's true.
Okay, well, just because it covered a lot of people and theories over time. So, but we're going to get in deeper to all this, right? Okay.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, this is it's sort of to be expected. Throwing all those names at you right away. Okay.
But remember in the Hebrew scriptures, it was God hardening Pharaoh's heart. That's not free will. So to me, right away in that first couple of books, you get that problem.
Yeah, it's and the free will. I mean, it's curious in that Augustine is certainly noticing free will as a thing, but Augustine is, he's living almost 1,000 years after the stories about the Exodus were written down. So, it's not clear that far back whether they really were tracking the concept of free will when in the time when the stories were written. But
Okay.
it is a curious point for going forward, is that, well, what are theologians going to do with that if they're going to reference scripture? And it's like, well, wait a second, God seems perfectly happy to mess with someone's free will.
Indeed.
Yeah. Well, and then well, and there the other, like, I was thinking of Jonah, just heard a sermon about Jonah, and that's a different kind of example. He's not messing with Jonah's mind directly, kind of like the way the hardening heart seems messing with Pharaoh's mind, but Jonah just manipulates physically.
Right.
Get him to do something. Oh. Okay, so all right, to get into some of the details. The first bit of detail, sort of with this guy John Roth, is it's curious in that there are people who talk like he does, but they come at the idea from different perspectives. So a lot of Roth's primary references are Jewish thinkers, and so there is definitely a line in Jewish thought that's following what he's talking about, which in the end is going to be the idea that God is not all good. So remember, the structure of the problem is trying to combine the ideas of infinite power with infinite goodness and the existence of evil. Well, and usually we throw in omniscience, but people seem to intuitively think, well, if something's omnipotent, it would be omniscient too. But anyway, technically you need all three. And then whence then is evil. So you can, the problem falls away when either one of those three pillars, omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence, the omnis, if you take any one of those three away, the problem goes away, or at least you find a way to navigate the problem in which you can understand that it's happening for some understandable reason, humanly understandable perhaps, or coming close to it. Anyway, so Jewish thought has because it's much older than Christian thought, dealt with the idea that God is not infinite for a long time, because the infinite construction is something that comes and builds with time. And obviously in Hebrew scriptures, the stories about God are conveying a God who can be emotional and reactive, and so the idea that you're navigating a personality, is part of that understanding. It gets complicated and more sophisticated over time, but given that it has those roots, the power of the problem presents itself kind of differently in some ways. There's sort of this intuitive move that a lot of Jewish thinkers make into that direction. Well, God is just inexplicable. And I found a version of that. Yom Kippur was yesterday, and there's one of in the prayer book for the Reform movement that has a reading that I thought really illustrated this very well. And this is this taken from a book by a rabbi named Will Berkowitz, who was born in 1968. So actually just a little bit younger than I am. So a very modern thinker. And one version of this kind of thinking is often referred to as postmodern. And one of them is going to be kind of evangelical Calvinist. And I'm going to show you a version of that as well. So, but all three of those lines of thought, right? You have this sort of traditional Jewish way of thinking that gets at okay, God's going to be inexplicable and maybe goodness can't be relied on 100% of the time. That could be an old Jewish thought, it can be a postmodern thought, and it can be a Calvinist thought. And those people do not agree with each other on the rest of their theology. So it's interesting that they all will agree on this answer to the problem of evil. Okay, anyway, here's the quote from Berkowitz. It's not easy to forgive God. It takes huge effort. It's painful, contradictory, and maddening. The human suffering that surrounds us feels utterly unforgivable, but I will forgive God because I do not want to write off the relationship. Because I feel there is too much to be lost by simply walking away. Because I want my children to develop their own relationships and come to their own conclusions. Because despite the pain, sorrow, and suffering, I want my universe full of miracles, not void of them. Because I do not want to be one more angry old cynic in the world. I want to believe a voice still calls out from Sinai, from heaven. That is why I will forgive God. I want to engage in the eternal conversations with the ancestors and sages. Despite it all, I want to live my life in praise and awe, in wonder and hope, even if I'm wrong, even if at the end there is nothing but darkness. So this is postmodern, and postmodernism is a name for a cultural movement that starts kind of early 20th century. We refer to the modern period going back to the end of the Enlightenment. So the intellectual world kind of goes through this renaissance in the late Middle Ages, and then there's the Enlightenment, mid 1600s to really we think of it ending with Immanuel Kant's death in 1804. So there's Renaissance, and then there's Enlightenment, and then from 1800 going forward, that's people called that the modern period. And then we get into the 20th century. And one of the things about the modern period is this very strong emphasis on truth and knowledge and the human capacity to know and understand. We get this rise of science that's coming from the 1600s forward. And so the Enlightenment is bringing forward all of these ideas about human thinking, human enlightenment. 20th century gets to be a little more contentious, and we start getting different, cat is misbehaving. Different set of philosophical ideas that are now questioning the human capacity to really understand, and some of this, along the way, is reacting to scientific understandings. Particular scientists noticing that since we all have individual brains, and we're all collecting information in very different ways, we can all have different understandings of things, even if we're watching the same event. And so that's the kind of thing postmodern thinkers will pick up and then argue, well, there really is no ultimate truth. It's all about these individual perspectives. And that's kind of the hallmark of postmodern thought. But in giving up that idea that there is an ultimate truth, you allow now this kind of move intellectually. It's like, well, I'm going to believe in God because I want to. Well, is there a God or isn't there? Well, I don't know. I don't need to know. I want to believe. I'm going to believe. Aha. So very postmodern move. Roth is doing some of that too. So he's primarily referred to as a postmodernist. He's just a Jewishly informed postmodernist. He is a Christian. But that's his version, is this postmodernism, really, that I know that I want to believe this, therefore this is what the consequence of that desire on my part is, that I have to accept that the God I'm believing in is not always going to be good in terms of the world ways I understand the word good. And for postmodern thought, that's like a really comfortable thing to do, because, well, of course, God's going to have a very different understanding than I do, just as you all have different understandings than I do, but God's is going to be very, very different. So if there is a God, but see, I don't know, maybe there's not, but I'm going to believe anyway. So this is not something that gets a lot of attention with the general public. It's not a kind of construct that's gonna sell in the pews, as it were. But among intellectuals, it's been very important in the 20th century.
And it's pretty powerful too, in that it embraces the totality of the awe of where we live, and trying to weigh that with the terrible things that are happening too. So I think it's a pretty powerful argument.
Well, and there's an older version that's sort of referenced in Catholic thought, which is about mystery. Like, well, so you don't understand. All right, you're human. You don't understand. That's like, why do you think you should understand? World's complicated. So yeah, so there's that version of it too. And it's what's interesting. So the postmodernists are not going to talk about mystery because they sort of understood that not understanding is part of the story, so they don't have to reference it. They don't have to call it out directly. But when we get to the kind of Calvinist view, that's going to be picking up the mystery angle really strongly.
But Richard, I think that the existentialists saved us from all this thinking. They made us, well, I'm not saying we use the will for everything. We use it for breathing. But I think the existentialists ask us to take the responsibility of this earth, what we do. And we don't hand it over to some unseen thing. So I'm very happy for Sartre and Camus.
Yeah, and then that's a very modern take on it. What's interesting, yeah, it's sort of, and it's what seems to me is that when we get to, the 1920s and now there are people like Sartre and Camus around, they seem to be kind of accepting that the ideas about God are all false, that they've inherited, and they're navigating a world now that's wrestling with, well, okay, what does it mean that we're going to accept all of that? Where for Hume, because he's so much earlier in time, he can't quite go there. He's going to question God, and he may in fact be an atheist, but he's not expecting society to have to navigate the problem of what does atheism imply. But for Sartre and Camus, that becomes the problem. Well, what does this really imply now? So they've moved kind of beyond the debate, should I believe in God or not, to now, what do I do with the consequences of the fact that I don't? So it's very interesting, also very important that it's happening in a certain order in history that way.
Richard, that nice quote that you read, couldn't all those things be possible without God? All of the world and all the attributes that he said he wanted for his children, could they not be attained without God?
Well, remember, he keeps using the word like relationship. So it's the relationship with something that he's calling God.
Oh, that's a good distinction. Okay, so he's saying a relationship is significant.
That's what he's preserving. I'm going to preserve the relationship by this, what Kierkegaard would call a leap of faith. I'm going to believe. Yeah, Janet?
But for that, you
This
use your
question of awe, I mean, the use of the word awe that Berkowitz was using, and Nancy, you referred to this evil thing. So when Berkowitz uses the word awe, he's using it, as I understand it, in a context of good. Awe is the wow, so to speak, that the rabbi was talking about, Hershey.
Yeah.
But he's not talking about awe from the fear sense, as I interpret that quote. So is anybody talking about their relationship with awe as evil?
Well,
I mean, aside from satanic worshipers, I mean, does somebody find virtue in the evil in some way? I don't, whether it's fear-inducing, then we get to the scale question, but it seems that when he uses awe, he only meant it good.
Yeah, right. I see what you're saying. Yeah, and in fact, the best, the kind of foundational book in this regard is a book called The Idea of the Holy by a German, really German anthropologist named Rudolf Otto. He was doing some early comparative religious studies work. And he was an early victim of the Nazis. But
can you put that in the chat maybe so we get that?
Yeah, sure. So the book is in English anyway. It's called The Idea of the Holy, and he has this construction of that, sort of like Because the point he's trying to get at is, well, what is it people mean? And he when he says people, he means humans around the planet from thousands of years ago up to today. What is it that what's going on here? And what he comes up to, he puts it into Latin, because of course, you know, he's a scholar. But he says, he calls it mysterium tremendum et fascinans. And in English, that means mysterious, tremendous, and fascinating. And the tremendous, he means tremors. So tremors caused by fear. So that the holy is there is power, and that power is awesome in an old-fashioned sense that also includes that this is overwhelming to me and could be very threatening to me because it is so much bigger than me. So yeah, so anyway, so in terms of how religious people have talked about used the word awe for thousands of years, Otto's convinced that's a big part of it, is that if you don't have that tremors, you know, it's not really the holy, because that's an important piece. I think, you know, and it might be under the influence of the postmodernists too, because certainly for the last 50 years, it seems like that Otto's emphasis on the tremors has been dropping, has been decreasing over time. And so there are more and more people who will talk about awe and leave that kind of part out of it. That it's more like you were describing, they're sort of tracking the positive parts, but they've let go of the thing that might be threatening to them or negative somehow. But it is there historically.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Helena, did you have one last thought?
No, well, lots of things. I'm struggling through, but
Uh-oh.
Rose,
I think yeah.
it's very important. We have the will to breathe. You know, the first thing we do when we are born, we have the will to breathe. So we need the will. It's very necessary. But how are we going to use it?
Mm-hmm.
That's the problem.
Yes, indeed.
That still is a problem. But I like the questioning. I mean, if you know it all, well, why would you?
Interesting.
Well, and I think too, up until the Enlightenment, every civilization or peoples stood in awe and understood that there was a sacredness to things. And then the Enlightenment came along, and you know, we tend to poo-poo that idea.
Yeah, the power of science to explain.
Right, everything.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm more a mystery girl myself. So
But you don't need religion to have awe for things.
No, it's just
you look at nature, and there is awe there. And I think that was probably what Spinoza meant. I find Spinoza very interesting, but very difficult.
Yes.
What was the third? What was the third? So it was mystery, tremendous, and
fascinating.
Fascinating.
Yeah. Okay. Mysterium tremendum et fascinans. Okay, so I don't think it's going to be worth watching this whole video, but it's worth getting a sense of the flavor of it. So this guy Thomas J. Ord is the director. Let's see, I think I actually have that website up. Is the director of something called the Center for Open and Relational Theology. Oh, sorry, Nina.
Oh, I was just gonna. This is technical, and I think you've done it. You can make the screen bigger so that we can see the whole screen on these videos. But I think you've done it on this one.
Oh, well, this is just his the splash page on their website.
Oh, okay. But
okay, on the others, I can try and do that too. Okay. Anyway, so one very contemporary move is to give up the idea of infinite power. So remember, if you you really just need to give up one of those three things: omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence. So Roth is giving up omnibenevolence. This thing called process that we're going to get from Griffith is giving up the power piece. Process is the name for a very specific school of thought that comes from an English philosopher and physicist named Alfred North Whitehead, who was a contemporary of Einstein's and also worked in quantum theory. So very, very technical, high-level physicist, but Whitehead was also a philosopher, and he came up with this system, which is insanely complicated. David Ray Griffin has edited the book that lays his theory out, the big book that he wrote that laid it out. So he's been sort of the leading disciple of Whitehead. There is the generic name for this approach is either open or relational. That different people have used those words, but what they mean with the word open theology or relational theology is they mean some version of a construct of theology that is stepping back from infinite power. So there are lots of different ways one might approach that in terms of the details. Process is the very specific details that come from Alfred North Whitehead's system of thought, and the book that he wrote was called, he called it Process and Reality. And so that's where process comes from, the name of process theology. And he means very much, the language is pretty, that much, the name is actually clear in the sense that he wants us to think about reality in a developmental sense, that the reality happens. It's not a thing, sort of, it's in process. So process and reality. Okay, anyway, so open and relational theology, it's Thomas J. Ord is going to be one of the guys in the video. The other guy, the other guy, his name is John Peckham. I don't actually know, I meant to and got distracted. I didn't look him up because I don't really actually know much about him, but he definitely strikes me as Calvinist. I mean, not all Calvinists would make the move he's going to make, but the way he's doing it seems very Calvinist to me. Anyway, he's coming at it from a very conservative point of view in terms of the construct of the theology, where Ord is very liberal. And so for Peckham, what he can't give up, because it's very conservative, he can't give up power. It's very, very important in his theology that God is very, very powerful. And you're gonna see this again when we get to Stephen Davis in the book, the guy who also edited the book. That's going to be the priority they want to keep. Process and open theology here is really wants to hold on to something else. They want to hold on to the omniscience and the benevolence, but the combining them gives them something very powerful that they want to hold on to. Peckham is willing to let it go, and so it's interesting to see a little bit of that contrast between the two of them. Okay.
Well, today on the show, we're looking at two approaches to solving the problem of God and evil. It's an age-old question. If God is all-powerful and entirely good and loving, why is there so much evil in the world? Two Christian thinkers, both seeking to find answers to this question, join me today, but with quite different theological approaches. John C. Peckham is Professor of Theology and Christian Philosophy at Andrews University in Berrien Springs, Michigan. His latest book, Theodicy of Love, Cosmic Conflict and the Problem of Evil, suggests that God's love is at the center of a cosmic drama that provides significant insights into the problem of evil. Thomas J. Ord is a theologian and philosopher, director of the Center for Open and Relational Theology. His latest book, which is actually available for free on his website, is God Can't: How to Believe in God and Love after tragedy, abuse, and other evils. But he's known for his alternative approach to the issue of how God acts in the world, which was set forth really in his 2015 book, The Uncontrolling Love of God. There he makes the case for what he calls the essential kenosis of God, that God is not in control of the physical world, but emphasizes God's inherently non-coercive love in relation to creation. Make sure there are links to both my guests from today's show as well. And I think we're in for a fascinating discussion today. So first of all, both John and Thomas, welcome along to the program.
Thank you, Justin.
Good to be talking with you guys.
It's great to have you both. Maybe we'll start with you, John. You were the instigator of this show, I think, in many ways. Tell us a little of your background and why you started to write on the subject of the problem of evil.
Yeah, I grew up as a PK, a pastor's kid, and for as long as I can remember, I was wrestling with the problem of evil, suffering, injustice in the world, going into the city and doing soup kitchens and other things. It really troubled me a great deal. So that is the main reason that I ended up becoming a theologian, becoming a systematic theologian, because I found it difficult to reconcile the kind and amount of evil that we see in this world with the fact that there is a loving God. So this work, in many ways, it brings to fruition a lot of the goals that I set out for a long time ago when I was very young.
And as you've got to grips with that in a theological, philosophical way, have you had any major shifts in the way you've approached the problem of evil and suffering?
I have had a lot of shifts, a lot of things that I have discovered in wrestling with the problem that have helped me to think through it quite a bit more. I very much appreciate the free will defense of the kind that Alvin Plantinga has laid out, that free will of the kind that God does not determine. God grants that kind of free will. The world is better with that kind of free will than it would be otherwise. I think it's better because I think love requires that kind of free will. But insofar as God grants that kind of free will, it's not up to him whether creatures use their free will to do evil. Sadly, creatures have used their free will to do evil, and that's why there is evil in the world, I believe.
But do you take it obviously beyond that to some extent in this book? Because obviously the way people use their free will is not the only way in which evil exists in the world. There is, as we call it, natural evil, earthquakes, disaster, illness, disease, and so on. And a lot of people will say, yeah, well, the free will defense is one thing, but why would God set up the world in such a way that all of these terrible evils can nevertheless befall people, apparently not from any kind of act of their own misuse of their free will?
Yes, absolutely. That's one of the reasons I wrote the book, because there appear to be many kinds of evils. You mentioned some that it seems an omnipotent God could prevent without undermining anyone's free will. And so I think we can be helped here by retrieving the motif of cosmic conflict, which is pervasive in Scripture, also very well represented in the Christian tradition. And the cosmic conflict says that there is a conflict between God's kingdom and a demonic realm, which consists of creatures who were created perfectly good, but fell of their own free volition and rebelled against God, and are involved in a conflict opposing God's kingdom.
No, this is the other thing. Keep in mind, like, this is not at all. Jews would never talk this way because they don't believe in a fall. But also, it's always strange, the idea that there can be something that has power in a world where there is an omnipotent power. That anyway, I don't know what those people are thinking, but we'll just have to let that go. But it's just curious that this view has to be there by the time of the first century, right? When the Christian world is being born, people in the area of Palestine, the Jewish community there, and there's other little religions that are mixing in as well. But on a popular level, just the level of the people, there is a lot of superstition. So remember the stories about Jesus, right? He's casting out demons and healing people and stuff like that. In a in the most sophisticated constructs of the religion, that kind of stuff is just childish nonsense to the priests in the temple. They just, that, I don't know what what you people are doing. That's not how the world works. But the people are starting to get attracted to this kind of thinking, which is an odd return to magical. So because in the history of human beings and how religion evolves, it really does all start with the magic of animism. Actually, I'm reminded here, I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about this point. So here we'll do it. So it starts what we call animism, and the animists believe that everything has a kind of spirit to it, literally everything. Even things we don't think of as things have spirits. So the world is, and the spirits have their own desires, and some of them might be in line with what humans want, and others in conflict with what humans want. And so that becomes an easy way to explain bad things because, well, there's some spirit causing it. It turns out there are actually reasons to do with human psychology about why we're prone to make these kinds of assumptions. So it's a deeply human thought to confront a world of mystery and respond with animism. Animism, as civilizations sort of develop and grow, you get agriculture and people settle down into cities and they start developing things like schools. So so you get more sophisticated ideas coming out of the world. Those people are going to move into what we call polytheism. So think about the Greeks and Romans. And actually, the early Hebrews were polytheists in this way too. The references, like in Genesis, to the plural, God says, "Let us make man in our image." What we think is the references to like a divine council in which Yahweh was the chair of that divine council, much like Zeus was the chief god in the Greek pantheon. So originally it looks very much like that polytheistic view. So that polytheism is popular around the world, obviously, in different places. Still, that would be how we would define the major forms of Hinduism. But as things move on, what we find developing in Jewish thought in this period, sort of 1,000 years ago to, 3,000 years ago to about 2,500 years ago, is that they're moving from polytheism proper to a view that's called henotheism. And let's see, it's also sometimes called monolarty. Technical differences between the two words, but not important to us. So henotheism would be the dominant term. And the henotheistic view is that the world is polytheistic, but only one of those gods matters to me or to my society. So that's really the world that the Hebrew Bible lives in, is a henotheistic world. It's very comfortable with the fact that other people have gods, but the Hebrew people have their God, and how they understand things like interstate conflict is that it's a conflict between the gods. And here, remember, the word host in biblical terminology refers to an army. So the heavenly host is the army that God has in heaven. And what they think is that, well, if the Assyrians are attacking, and so the Assyrians did in fact conquer the northern kingdom of Israel in 791 BC, what they imagine is happening is that the Assyrian god and these gods are usually male, his armies are going against Yahweh and Yahweh's armies, and how the divine battle turned out, because the same thing will happen on earth. And what happened in that battle was Yahweh lost, and the Assyrian god must have won because the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom. They kicked out a lot of the rulers, and that's where we start getting actually the proper biblical stories coming in, because it seems like their major point is about combining these two societies, the northern kingdom with the southern kingdom.
But sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
This guy's a conservative Christian. I mean, how does he reconcile the idea that he's got two gods? I mean, if there's a good God and a bad God, you know, because it's supposed to be the three monotheisms.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I'll get there in just 1 second. We'll do one thing on the way. So, because we have to get to monotheism. so henotheism, we get to the 1st century. On the ground, you get all of this superstition, but among the intellectuals, they're moving into a line of thought that, oh, it's not that our God is our God and their God is their God. It's that there is only one God. And so our God and their God must be the same. They must be talking about the same thing, although they're just confused and doing it wrong. But there has to be only one God. And from there, you're going to get eventually constructs of power. But it's going to take time for that idea of God, even when there's one God, and some proper monotheism, to the idea that one God has infinite power. So omnipotence is going to be something that's going to come out of the Middle Ages. So it takes a lot of time. But the idea that God is powerful, of course, comes kind of naturally with the thinking that, oh, there's not many gods, there must be only one. And if there's only one, then that God must be really powerful, because that God would have the power of all of the other, we thought all the other gods had. They're actually, all that power is all rooted just in one God. Okay. So the problem of evil lurking in the background, because remember, that goes back to we get the ancient Greeks laying this out for us at first. So it's a problem that by the time the early Christian communities are around, it's a problem that people are aware of and they're thinking about. One answer to that problem that was popular at the time was called Manichaeism, and it was developed by a guy named Manichae. And that the basic thought was, well, we can explain good and evil by reference to competing powers in the universe. So there is a God who is powerful, but there is this competing power. Now, logically, you're right, this does not make any logical sense, because if God is omnipotent, then there can't be another power that is in conflict with that by definition. So I find this line of conversation really frustrating, because that contradiction seems so obvious and huge, and I don't know why he doesn't see it. But he doesn't. So what are we going to do? But Manichaeism was declared a heresy by the Catholic Church, so should have gone away a long time ago. But it's like, I suppose psychologically, not logically, psychologically, I think it can be comfortable for people to think that, yes, I am worshiping a God who's trying to do good things, but there's something getting in the way. And so as long as that's something else, then it's not God's fault exactly that something else is in the way. But therefore I can feel comfortable with it. I'm focused on the thing that's good, and I'm rejecting the things that are bad. And now I understand why those things are there. Right, it just flies in the face logically of this construct of omnipotence. But that's, again, so if he's coming back to what is really Manichaeism in a modern form. And there's because it seems to me Calvinists, because Calvin himself was not a believer in free will, that Calvinist thought has moved around a lot on these positions. And when it wants to adopt, when Calvinists want to push free will and really embrace free will, they find themselves in a problem that Calvin thought he got himself out of by not having the free will there. So now that they have it there, they got this problem again. And how am I going to solve the problem? And his solution is Manichaeism. I'm going to go back to that. So he's going to have lots of his reasons for why he thinks this works, and the other guy is going to come in with, well, I think there's a different way of solving the problem, as you'll see. So I think so. Anyway, so I wanted you to have that little background about how animism grows into monotheism. Any questions? Is that clear enough?
So this guy calls himself a systematic or it's theologian.
Systematic theologian. Yeah. So
that it goes.
Well, so theologians, when they're doing details of stuff, can focus on different sorts of things. The systematic theology is the idea that the theologian is trying to come up with an understanding of every piece of the puzzle. For Christian thought, there sort of that means that I'm gonna navigate three primary symbols, which are really from the Trinity, but Father, Son, and Spirit. And so God as Father is sort of ultimate reality. Son as Jesus is a reference to the community. So, how's that community function? How's the social piece of life work? And the Spirit will often be used to talk about knowledge and how we understand the world. Jewish systematic theology and Judaism uses God, Israel, and Torah. But so you get the same basic construct. There is ultimate reality, there is community, and there is how knowledge is functioning in those things. And if you're going to write about all three of them and how all three of those different symbols and their history and the tradition relate to each other, then we call that systematic theology. With the rise of postmodernism, a lot of that interest in that went way down, because that questioning of truth and stuff. And so in the last few decades, a lot of theologians have become kind of specialists in particular areas. And the one that gets the most attention from the public is what we call pastoral theology. So people were thinking about how is it that the clergy should wrestle with these kinds of questions of suffering and then talk to the parishioners about that problem. So pastoral theology, and that's where the emphasis on training ministers and counseling comes in. And so in our world, heavy emphasis on that pastoral theology. And we'll talk a little bit about that with the process people too, because I had a professor who was sort of the master of the process version of pastoral theology, a woman named Marjorie Suhaki. Interesting person, retired now. Also, she was also at Claremont. Okay, I think that covers everything. Any other questions? All right, can't see quite everyone to make sure there's a hand. Okay, all right, let's keep going.
That raises another question immediately. How could there be any conflict between an omnipotent God and any creatures, the devil and his cohorts or anyone else? And there could only be a conflict if the conflict is not a conflict of sheer power, but a conflict of a different kind. And I think there is a good biblical reason to believe that the conflict is a conflict over God's character, a conflict caused by slanderous allegations raised by the devil against God's character and his government, which the devil raised before a heavenly court. And those kinds of allegations against one's character cannot be settled by sheer power. There's no amount of power that a king could exert in order to prove to his subjects that he is good and loving. No amount of executive power or action could prove to citizens that a mayor or president is not corrupt. If allegations of character have been raised, then this is an epistemic conflict, primarily a conflict about whether people believe that God is good, or whether creatures believe that God is good and loving. If the conflict is a conflict of that kind, in order for God to defeat those allegations, which defeating them is not only for his own sake, but for the sake of the entire universe, because if creatures don't fully trust God, they can't love God. And this is part of where all of the kinds of disharmony comes from. The only way to defeat those kinds of allegations is for there to be some kind of a demonstration, a fair and open demonstration. In order for there to be that kind of demonstration, though, the enemy must be allowed to make his case within some consistent parameters. And I think there's a lot of evidence that there are such consistent parameters operating in this world that I call rules of engagement. These rules of engagement are those things that have been agreed to before the heavenly court or the heavenly council that limit the activity of the devil and his cohorts, but also correspondingly morally limit God. Because if God always keeps his promises, which I believe that he does, then insofar as God commits himself to some rules of engagement, God morally cannot contravene those commitments that he has made. So in a real sense, I believe there are many evils in the world that God morally cannot prevent. Although he has the sheer power to prevent them, he morally cannot, given his commitments to free will in general, but also more specifically to the rules of engagement that are in place in this cosmic conflict. Eventually, the cosmic conflict is resolved by the suffering God of the cross. If we look to the God who voluntarily lowers himself, dies on the cross in Christ, we see that this God can be trusted. And it's through what God does that God defeats the allegations and provides the ultimate demonstration of his righteousness and his love that finally defeats the enemy's allegation and allows God to win the cosmic conflict and usher in an eternity of bliss and harmony.
Obviously,
now, it's complicated, it's clever, but I think it's nonsense. So I don't want you to worry too much about trying to make sense out of what he's saying, that you should try to the goal here is for you to understand and see how this makes sense. It doesn't make sense, but it is very complicated.
Richard, I wanted to say how much I appreciate what you had said before about not gendering God. He's gendering God a lot.
Yeah, and it's weird. I mean, the solution to this was developed 50 years ago, and I don't know why people are so slow taking it up. I learned it from Sue Hockey in her class. You just don't use pronouns. I mean, it's that easy. Just
Exactly.
don't use the pronoun. But anyway, yeah, it's still hard for some people to get beyond that. Yeah, Marcia.
It seems to me that if God were both benevolent and omnipotent, there would have been no wars.
Well, that's the problem, right? Yeah.
There would be no crime. There would have been no Auschwitz.
Yeah.
I cannot believe in an omnipotent God, because if I were to believe in an omnipotent God, I would believe that a sadist is running the universe.
Yeah,
and I don't want to believe that.
Yeah, that's and so this guy Thomas J. Ord, I think this is exactly the line of thought he's picking up. That he's gonna completely agree with that way of thinking.
And I think that a lot of the stories in the Old Testament, and I'm sorry, I may be about to offend a lot of people, but I believe a lot of the stories in the Old Testament were written by abusive men who wanted to justify their abusive behavior, like Abraham and Isaac. See, God does it, so it must be okay for me to do it.
Well, and I mean, in a historical, yeah, they certainly weren't, they didn't understand themselves to be abusive, but in a modern sense, when we look back on them, they can certainly look that way. Yeah.
Well, a lot of abusers today don't understand themselves.
Oh, certainly. Yeah, exactly.
Either.
Oh, yeah.
But other people have come to understand it as that.
No, it's interesting, on the Isaac story, it's interesting that the textual scholars are of the opinion of late that it's quite possible that child sacrifice was actually relatively common at one time, even among the Hebrews, and that in the original story, he sacrifices Isaac, and that's why he's such a great follower of God. And it's later on, the story is edited to make it so he doesn't sacrifice Isaac, as the community is turned and rejected child sacrifice. And so it goes from a story celebrating child sacrifice to a story condemning child sacrifice. So the text is not always obvious about what it's really about either until you get into the details.
Richard, it was interesting that he called humans creatures. He never referred to people, he just said creatures.
Yeah, that's old biblical language. Yeah.
Oh, is it?
It's yeah, I mean, I can see why it's a little jarring. I'm just more used to it, but yeah, so
Oh.
it didn't stand out to me, but I understand why it would be jarring if you're not used to it.
Yeah, I was taken aback by that.
Yeah, it's kind of old fashioned, but it's, yeah, so a little unusual for someone his age to use that, like, yeah, talk that way, but it's some way people have talked for, theologians have talked for a while.
Okay.
This goes well beyond some of the typical sort of more philosophical, if you like, ways in which people meet the question of God and evil. And we'll probably talk about some of those as we go along with Thomas as well. But I mean, the thing that I can immediately hear the average skeptical atheist listener of this show saying is, oh, well, great, you've got a kind of an explanation for this, but to me, it just sounds like a fairy tale. It just sounds like some very extravagant backstory to the Christian story, which basically gets you off the hook, maybe in some way. And I don't know, how do you respond to that? Because at the end of the day, it's one thing to kind of give a fairly kind of logical, philosophical defense, like Alvin Plantinga's as free will defense. And it's another thing then to go into the realm of the ancient.
By the way, Alvin Plantinga, I think he might have died recently. If not, he's very elderly, but very famous Protestant theologian. And it's this free will defense is what he became famous developing.
And demons and some kind of cosmic drama that's been going on since the beginning of eternity or whatever. What would you say to the skeptic who says, well, yeah, sounds like an interesting story, but you know, not one that I have to believe in?
Yeah, it's a fair question and understandable from somebody who would come from an atheist or agnostic background. I think that it's first important to clarify that this is not just some just so story. I think that a story of the cosmic conflict is just embedded in the story of the gospel. Mm-hmm. You cannot read very far in the book of Matthew without encountering this kind of demonic conflict that Christ is involved in throughout his ministry. It's all over the Bible elsewhere, and even a part of what scripture emphasizes Christ came to do, to destroy the power of the devil, to destroy the works of the devil, etc. So when it comes to somebody who may not already agree that this kind of story is true, I would say, first of all, that the way Plantinga puts it, plausibility is in the ear of the hearer. So what one considers to be plausible is going to depend a great deal on one's background beliefs. If one believes that there is a God, particularly the God of the Bible or the God of Christianity, whose son is Jesus Christ, believes that the gospel narratives really happened, which I believe that they did, then there's going to be a cosmic conflict motif or framework that comes along with that. And given a belief in a supernatural God, belief in Jesus and the gospel story, I think it is indeed very plausible from a Christian perspective that there is such a cosmic conflict operating in the world. So I would just ask that the atheist or agnostic would allow me, if they're asking me to make a defense with regard to the problem of evil, that I would be allowed to use the core beliefs of the framework that I come from, the Christian framework, and this cosmic conflict narrative is just embedded in the Christian story.
No, I do find it ironic that, right, this is the modern PhD educated professor, and he's basing his worldview on the uneducated opinion of a bunch of illiterate peasants 2,000 years ago. And it's just like, okay. Anyway,
want to obviously explore it more as we go forward in the conversation soon, because I think we'll want to hear how that relates to the kinds of evils that we've been talking about, you know, disasters, earthquakes, illness and disease and so on. But the other perspective we've got on today's show, it's two Christian perspectives, but a very different Christian perspective in many ways, from Thomas J. Ord, who, as I said, is the author of God Can't, How to Believe in God and Love After Tragedy, Abuse and Other Evils, which very much picks up on his theology of the uncontrolling love of God. Thomas, welcome along to the show.
Yeah, it's great to be here with you.
It's worth my mentioning. Ord here he uses a language that sounds much more mainstream and typical than someone like Griffin, when he talks. That the process people have this very, very complicated, sophisticated construct that they're working with, and it is deeply informed by the Protestant tradition, although now popular with Catholics and Jews and some Muslims as well. Ord, I think part of it is because he's running this center where he's trying to appeal to lots of different people and sell them on a general version of this idea of God not being omnipotent. But in doing so, he casts this really wide net where he doesn't always sound to me completely consistent. Although I know, because I followed him a little bit, that he's really actually fairly sophisticated in his thinking. But when he's talking to a popular audience and he's trying to sell it, he will say things that I don't think he really quite means, but he thinks it is either illustrating an idea or somehow showing an audience who doesn't really know what he's talking about a way into what he's talking about. So anyway, so I just want to lay that out there. What we're going to get in the books is actually a more worked out version of his kind of thinking. So this is just a taste of it.
To have you on. Tell us a little bit then about what took you into sort of investigating these issues. Presumably you also maybe had a different way of approaching the problem of evil and suffering earlier on in your life, and then you came to a quite unique and different way of understanding this later on, didn't you?
Yeah, I think John and I share a lot in common in terms of our background. I was raised in a Christian home. I became one of those fanatical folks who would go door to door witnessing for Jesus, trying to get people to become Christians. But then when I got into college, I began to look more deeply into the big questions that I had been urging other people to look deeply into, and encountered some folks from atheistic, agnostic, or other religious perspectives. And they were really smart. And they kind of pulled the rug out from under the reasons I had for thinking there was a God. And so I remember coming to pick up my fiance, who's now my wife, and her getting into the car and me looking at her and saying, I just can't believe in God anymore. I was an atheist or an agnostic for a while. And the problem of evil was one of many particular issues that brought me to that place. I eventually came to think that it was more plausible than not that there was a God. And there was two major issues that brought me to that place. One was this deep intuition that I ought to be a loving person, that other people ought to be loving, and that I needed some kind of ground or framework or something that most people in the Christian tradition have called God to justify why I had these deep intuitions. And the second one is that I really felt like there had to be meaning in life, or at least I wanted there to be meaning in life. And I couldn't make sense of the possibility for ultimate meaning if there wasn't some kind of ground of meaning as well. Again, what many people call God. And so that kind of brought me back to the place where I began to believe it was more plausible than not that there was a God. I wasn't certain there's a God. In fact, I'm still not certain there is. But I began then to build from that kind of basis. And that eventually led me to the position that we're talking about today, a position that says that God loves everyone and everything, but God simply can't control anyone or anything. And the reason God can't do this is that God's nature is this self-giving and others empowering love. And because God's nature is love, and this love is this kind of gift, God simply can't control not only free will creatures, but any creature or any entity in all of reality, because God loves every creature and every entity in all of reality.
So funnily enough, I don't know if you're aware of this, but I actually had Mark Harris on my show 2 years ago, and he wrote a book very much inspired by your own work called Divine Echoes, Reconciling Prayer with the Uncontrolling Love of God, and debating in that case petitionary prayer with Steve Jeffries, who holds a Calvinist position. Now, that's not the position that John holds, I don't think, but nonetheless, it was interesting to hear him laying out the exactly what you've said there, this idea that God it does not have this coercive kind of form of engaging with humans. And it kind of led to that natural question, well, how does God get things done then, in a sense? What are the means by which God is able to influence or bring his purposes and plans together in some way? I mean, I'm taking it you're probably somewhere on, to give you a label, if you don't mind me doing so, Thomas, in the open theist kind of category of theologian, that you don't believe God knows what the future may hold. But yet, do you still have a kind of view that in some way God's purposes can still be done, even with every creature having absolute freedom in the universe?
Yeah, I'm an open relational theologian. I think God is active everywhere at all times, at every level of complexity and reality, from complex creatures like humans to quarks. So God is always active, but in every instance, in every case, God is never the sole actor. God never single-handedly determines any events. God is always calling, wooing, commanding, use all kinds of language from the Christian or other theistic traditions for that matter, so long as that language doesn't give the impression that God is the only one to bring about some kind of an event. So this God,
Yeah, see, okay, so that can sound a little misleading. Let me try and run through the way I learned to kind of explain how this is. I think he would agree with this, but this is very much what I'm going to try to explain to you is very much the process view. So, that idea about God is the God is not omnipotent, but omniscient and benevolent. So, okay, what does that look like? And there's a version from literature from the work of Douglas Adams, who's an English was an English comedian, wrote for people like Monty Python, and he has this really very funny collection of books that are science fiction-y that start with one called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And what he tells the story in these books, remember, this is all just science fiction, but that there is this way back in the past, in a very distant galaxy, there were these people who created this really powerful supercomputer that was based on a kind of cellular design, so that every part of the computer had a model of the whole computer within it. And what they discovered when they turned it loose is it had way too much power and was way too destructive. And so they had to destroy the computer. It's called deep thought. And in doing so, they pulverized the material that it was made out of. So the computer ends up sort of like a dust cloud around this planet. But all the pieces are still, all the pieces still have that plan from the original inside it. And somehow or another anyway, the pieces are able to talk to each other and kind of coordinate. But because it's just a diffuse cloud of particles, it doesn't have much power anymore, but it can nudge a hydrogen atom here or a helium atom there. And through these little nudges over a very, very long period of time, it can create things. And in this story, it creates something that looks like a spaceship, but it's really kind of a blueprint for how to make a spaceship that it allows to crash on this planet. And that keeps the story moving. In process, that's what God is like. So when he says God is everywhere at every level of reality, that is the process view that ultimate reality, and this actually comes from Whitehead's work in physics, that he thinks of ultimate reality as being composed of what he describes for our imagination as being like little bubbles. So imagine space has all of these little bubbles in it, but they're smaller than subatomic particles, like little tiny things. And one side of them is kind of a conscious side, and the other side is the material side. And the conscious side talks to all of the other little particles, and the material side is just what they are. But what we think of as moving, right, an object moving through space, I can't see me to see if that's working. Oh, let me do this. And I can see me. Okay, so you think about an object moving through space. What Whitehead is after in his view is that the book is not so much moving through space as the information that composes the physical structure of the book moves from bubble to bubble. He calls them monads, which is actually a reference to Leibniz, interestingly enough. Gottfried Leibniz, in his philosophical work, came up with a simplified version of this idea 200 years ago. But so the little bubbles, right, they contain the information that becomes physical objects. So objects don't really move. The information that composes the object is moving through the bubbles. Well, God can talk to all of those bubbles. So in the ultimate infinity of all of the bubbles that make up the whole universe, God is present in all of them. And so God knows everything that's happening in the universe, because anything that's moving through it, any movement, any existence in any bubble, God's aware of it. And like the computer deep thought, God can't tell them what to do, but God can nudge or encourage. So for example, Marjorie Suhaki liked to tell a story. Well, I'll give the example of, so imagine a little residential street, and there's a little boy playing with a ball in his front yard, and the ball bounces into the street. And there's a car coming, and the street's kind of crowded like our Seattle streets are, and the car driver can't see the ball or the boy. Well, Marjorie does pastoral work, so well, she in her imagination, she sees God tries to whisper to the little bubble that's kind of the core of the ball, whisper to it to bounce a little bit that way, you know, sort of get yourself out of the way a little bit. Don't go in the street. Go over here a little bit. So it's just these suggestions, and and God then can whisper to the little monad that is the core of the boy, don't go after the ball, don't go after the ball, don't go after the ball, and can whisper to the driver in the little monad that is the core of the driver, slow down, slow down, slow down. But in the end, God can't control what's going to happen. Whatever's going to happen is going to follow laws of physics and human psychology, and in this case, the ability of someone to actually see something that's being hidden from them by other cars. So a tragedy may befall the boy, but the point was God was struggling as hard as God could to get that to not happen. But fundamentally, her point is God is there with the boy and with the boy's parents and with the driver to try to comfort them, since they're all now being involved in a tragedy. So it's not God's fault that the boy got hit, because God couldn't do anything to stop it. And God tried as hard as possible to stop it, but just couldn't. So anyway, so that's what, when Ord is talking about other people or other things in the universe having power and doing stuff that's competing, that's what he means, is God may encourage the power of an earthquake to be less, but God isn't controlling the earthquake or the volcano, let alone the ball or the driver or the boy. All of them are actors in the story that have power, and in many ways more power than God has, at least in their immediate context. But God is there.
I would think that's a very unsatisfactory view to religions.
Well, you'll see. Well, that's part of what we'll get in the book, is the other guys, the other authors in the book are going to criticize this view. So you'll see how they do that. But what it does do is it does solve that problem of evil, because God is not responsible now. So you don't have a problem of evil with this view. So it works on that level. It has other problems, and you'll see the other people are going to talk about the issues they have and why they think there are things about it that aren't satisfying. So yeah, so that's all part of the conversation too. But anyway, that's what, just wanted you to, for the sake of understanding anyway, that's what these people are up to, is this kind of construct. You say God is not omnipotent, but omniscient. This is sort of what you end up with. Other questions? No? Okay, all right. Go ahead.
I feel like a lot of this is made up without any evidence at all.
Yeah, well, there's some of that. Theology is a really kind of curious game, because it wants to be, it struggles to be consistent logically, so it takes from philosophy that way. It has to be coherent in the tradition it's part of, and so it's going to take from the scriptures and from commentaries on scriptures, and then it's trying to speak to people today, to figure out whatever you're going to say, it should make sense to the audience who's going to read it while you're reading it. And so you have those three factors all coming in, and then the theologian is going to navigate all of that, and what you end up with sometimes can look like someone just pulled it out of the air.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I probably missed something, but okay. So the process view is saying God's not omnipotent.
Exactly.
And maybe I could say the Jewish view is that God's not omnibenevolent. But did we also cover what view says God's not, what was the third one? Omniscient.
Well, the omniscient usually just sort of comes hand in hand with omnipotent.
Okay.
So it's interesting. So the process people are having to decouple that sort of in our intuition, because our intuition wants to put them together. They're saying, you know what? It turns out you don't have to put them together. So, but there isn't a construct that isn't a direction any theologian I know of has ever gone.
Okay, so he didn't just miss it. She didn't just miss it. Wrong place, wrong time. Okay, got it. Thank you. I just wanted to cover all the bases.
Yeah, so it turns out the other two are going to be more popular as a move. But and if you keep them both, what you end up with, right, is the free will, defense, and mystery. So if you have them, you need something to augment your view, and that's why the free will defense brings that in. Yeah, Marcia.
I would say that if God is omnipotent, then God is probably omniscient also.
Right. That's, yeah, the people
But
often.
the converse is false.
That's, yes. Yeah. Yeah. An omnipotent God must be omniscient, but an omniscient God does not necessarily have to be omnipotent. Yeah.
And I'm willing to believe in omniscient and benevolent God. I have no trouble with that.
Yeah, what you're going to see of is how much traction do you get with that loss of power? Is that's going to become the open question. That's what Diana was pointing out.
So then, Richard, how does she cope or see the Holocaust?
Someone like Suhaki?
Yeah.
Well, that's God tries to discourage these things, and God doesn't have that power. So people do what people are going to do, and God tries to clean up the mess, but it can't stop it. So it's very much an emphasis on being present with people to comfort them. That becomes the thing that Suhaki spends her time emphasizing, is that her God is very much a God who's present with you.
Did that happen but did this happen in the Holocaust with the Jewish people, that they felt that God was with them still? I always wonder about that.
Well, I mean, they're these are people, and so they get lots of different opinions, and some people just gave up on God, and other people struggled, like Eli Wiesel, and how am I going to go on with this? And other people just, you know, okay, the world is bad sometimes, and that's the way the world is, and everything, you know, they just sort of accept that this is now what the world is bringing them without questioning God so much. So I mean, you can find in reading responses from survivors, you can find examples of all of those points of view.
Richard, if free will is the concept, what would be the point of prayer, asking God for things?
Well, petitionary prayer. I mean, most modern theologians don't think of God as you know, doing things that would respond to our prayers, because that would mean compromising that free will thing.
Right. Okay.
But you'll get a lot of talk about God being a friendly ear, kind of
that, I mean, I can understand a comfort, perhaps.
Yeah. You have to. Yeah, petitionary prayer is really is a very strange thing, because at some point you have to bring in the idea that God is messing with the system, and
right.
But you're not supposed to do that. So yeah, so that's why modern theologians generally will downplay the idea that has any kind of role in anything.
I mean, you see, it drives me nuts as sports people, you know, who either do the cross or do a prayer to win a game. It's like, oh my God, this is what you would petition a God for.
Taking sides, yeah, that's an especially kind of questionable move. I mean, there are more sophisticated people who, if they're going to do that kind of thing, they're just focusing on let everybody be safe. It's not about us winning and that people
exactly
lose.
World
Just
hunger.
Yeah, God cares about all of these people, not just one team. So you get both of that, I think, in sports too. But yeah, the primitive version is definitely still there too.
Yeah.
All right. Oh, looks like I went just a couple minutes over, so I should let you go.
Thank you so much.
Put a link out to the recording of class in case anyone is curious, but especially for the people who couldn't be here. So so next week I'll show you some more of this video because it's a great illustration of the kind of ideas we're getting in the book, and then I'm gonna try and go through some of the highlights of the first of Roth's chapter, and then I'll focus especially on the critiques to get the back and forth between these different thinkers going. All right, thank you all very much.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
Bye.
All right, stop.